So remember last time we said different type of studies. There's descriptive studies, and then there is explanatory studies. We said, or at least I said that usually the type of descriptive studies that we do, I mean, a lot of people do descriptive studies, but oftentimes they're not really that interesting because, you know, if you're just describing something that other people have talked about before, then it's then you either say, I found the same thing or I found something different. But if you find something different and you can't explain why, then it's not very interesting. So once you start to explain why, you might find something different. Then you're into explanatory studies. And so explanatory studies is mostly what people end up, what we look at. And that these can be clinical trials where what you're doing and it's your, kind of changing one factor, sort of, but only one factor to sort of see, well, what's the impact if I change that? Or it could be an intervention where you're going through and that you're trialing like a diabetes prevention, or you're trialing a tobacco program, whatever it's going to be. And so you're going to evaluate that. It can be some type of public health intervention or trial, whatever it is. And then what you do is that then you kind of have your design just to help you sort out, help you figure out what the impacts are going to be. And so we're going through the different type of designs. Right, where the difference case in this case is that experimental means that you're manipulating something, and observational means you're not manipulating it. So like a randomized controlled trial is an experimental type of trial, because what you're doing is that you're giving one group one thing and another group something else. But a observational one is where you're not manipulating it, you're just observing who gets what. Okay, so we started talking about descriptive ones, and let's see, we went through case controls and talked about, the key of case control is that you are beginning with people who have the outcome, then you're looking to see if you can predict why, who has or why people have an outcome versus why people don't. An example that we were giving is that, okay, so lead intake and seizures. So you're looking at children, lead intake, and whether or not they get seizures or not. So in this case, is the dependent variable, well, what's the dependent variable and what's the independent variable? Or would it be the other way? Does lead cause seizures or does seizures cause lead? So lead is the independent and seizures is the dependent, right? So that's a case where, remember, so ask yourself, which is factor one, the independent, and which is leads to factor two, dependent. Right? So when you start doing this, whenever you get some type of question like this, just start by asking yourself this question, which is causing what? So in this case, lead intake causes seizures. Right? Okay. So that's your independent dependent variable. So how would you do a case control study of this?
When I understood, you would start with subjects probably have seizures and then investigate lead exposure levels.
That's right. So you start here. You start by finding these groups, right? And then what you do is that so you find a group that has seizures, and yes, and you find another group that has no seizures. And then what you do is that you then go and you look in the past, you ask them questions to figure out, well, like, can you predict what is causing the seizures versus no seizures? Does that make sense? So, So this is a case control because you start with your cases and then you go back and you're trying to, you're looking in the past. So how would you find people with seizures? Children. How would you find children with seizures? I mean, it's a rare event, right? How would you find children with seizures? Say it again. Hospitals, right? Or go to a neurologist or a pediatrician or whoever it's going to be. So you start with someone who's going to see children who have seizures, and then you enroll them. And then how do you so that's this group. How do you then pick this group? You just pick anyone who doesn't have a seizure? Yeah. That's right. So yeah. So you ask, so before you would done your research and you would have seen, well, what type of things predict whether people have seizures, whether children have seizures, right? Besides that. And so you get all the different type of factors that you can think of, like, low socioeconomic status usually is a predictor, living in being, I think, underweight at birth is a predictor. So all these different things. And that then you pick this group to be somewhat similar. That's a special, I mean, you don't have to do that, to be honest with you. You can just do a case control study where you just get your group and then you just pick any. But the problem is you're going to face with that is that, let's say if you're looking at this relationship, lead leads to seizures, right? Well, what if it's actually not lead that leads to seizures, but instead it's something like it's like being underweight at birth. So let's say underweight at birth, but that's really the thing that causes seizures like that. But when you go through and then you ask people, right? You don't ask this question. You don't ask whether they're underweight at birth. Instead, you just ask lead. Well, if being underweight at birth is also more likely to mean you're going to live in a house where there's lead, then it might look like there's a relationship between lead and seizures, but only because there's this spurious correlation that goes on here. So that's what's called the epi people call the ecological fallacy. Right? The ecological fallacy. If you take an epi, did they talk about that? Who took epi? Did they talk about ecological fallacy? What it basically means is that two things are correlated, but there's no relationship. I mean, they're correlated like that, and you measure the one thing but not the other, is that it's going to look like this is a relationship when really that's the relationship. So that's why what you want to do is ideally when you choose your control group here, is that you try to find people who are like, who are similar in these other types of characteristics, and then you measure those characteristics as well. You control them. Okay. Advantages of doing it, easy to do. One of the reasons why case control is done so often is that it's an easy thing to do, especially for rare conditions. Like, if you think about, if you're trying to do this type of study in some other way, then you have to find children with seizures. Seizures are so rare that you'd have to have a gigantic sample in order to get enough children with seizures like that. So therefore, it's easier just to go out there and find children with seizures, find the control group, and then see if you can sort out the relationship. Okay. Cross-sectional, similar to case control, and that's all takes place at one point in time. Right. So case control, what you're doing is you're choosing people, and then you're giving them a survey. So there's no follow-up, there's no manipulation or anything else. You're just finding people and giving them a survey. Cross-sectional is the same type of thing, where what you're doing then is that you begin with your study population, and then you're looking to see from your study population who has an event versus who doesn't have an event, and then you look to see what the risk factors are. So the big difference between a cross-sectional and a case control is that a cross-sectional is that you're not necessarily choosing the group, specifically going out and finding people with a condition. So lead intoxication or lead intake and hyperactivity in children. How would you do this in a cross-sectional study? What's your dependent variable? Hyperactivity, because lead causes hyperactivity. Hyperactivity doesn't cause lead, right? Is that right? Although I think I gave you the example last time about my children, when they were, tested for lead, and after they were positive, so what they do when they test for lead is that you have there's actually two different tests they give you. They give you kind of a simple test, and then if you're high on that one has a lot of high false positives. So what they do is they use that as a screening test, and then they go through and that they then if you're high in that, then they give you a blood test, and the blood test is what really kind of tells it. And so they were high in that first one, and so when they got the blood test, they weren't high. So they were, had that false positive on the first one, and thankfully they were negative on the second one. But in between those 2 points, right, when we're waiting for the blood test to occur, they're like 3 and 4 and 1, 4 and 2 at this point. And I start noticing about how kids at that age just lick everything. So like they start licking the walls. And I thought to myself, I've never seen them lick the walls before, but what kids do. So that's a case where hyperactivity might actually cause lead intake, because if you got someone who's really, really bouncing off the walls, then they're more likely to do things like lick the walls. But for the most part, you probably think it goes the other way, right? Because you probably think it's saying lead intake in the past is leading to hyperactivity now. So what you're looking for is not necessarily the relationship between lead now and hyperactivity, but rather lead intake previously than hyperactivity, right? So your dependent variable then is hyperactivity. Your independent variable is lead. So how would you do this study? As a cross-sectional, which means you're not going to start by finding kids who are hyperactive. So, or finding kids with lead poisoning. So how would you do this as a cross-sectional?
Population of kids in low economic background.
Or even high economic. Could be either one. I mean, but could be, yeah. So if you think that it's low, yeah, good point. Because if you think that it's low economic, is going to be more likely where you're going to have lead paint, then do it in low economic areas. On the other hand, back in the East, lots of houses, even nice houses, people in high economic areas have lead. So you could probably just do it with everyone. But the idea is that you just survey everyone, all the kids, and then you're looking, how would you measure their hyperactivity? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you measure hyperactivity. How would you figure out how to measure hyperactivity? Yeah.
Could you maybe look at previous studies?
Yeah. You look to see if there's some type of hyperactivity scale that you can get to measure hyperactivity. How would you measure lead intake? Yeah, so you could do blood samples, right? But typically, I mean, so a cross-sectional survey or study could be done where you get a clinician in and measures their hyperactivity, right? So you get a psychologist, child psychologist, to assess their hyperactivity, and you also then get a blood sample. That would be a way of kind of doing it in a more accurate way. If you wanted to do it in a less accurate way, but that's easier, then you could find a scale that they could use for this, and then maybe find out, the area that they lived in, the house they live in, or the region they live in, or whatever it's going to be. But somehow you'd have to link up to try and link the likelihood that they're going to have lead exposure. So that's the cross-sectional, because you're doing it with everyone. You're not specifically, choosing one group or the other. Instead, you're doing it with everyone. What's the advantage of doing it that way? What's the advantage of a cross-sectional approach versus a case control approach?
You get an overall the presentation is more accurate, for the entire population than just selected group or selected.
That's exactly right. So if you think about the way, like with the seizures, how did I suggest we're gonna get people with seizures? Yeah, hospital or pediatrician, right? Who does that miss out?
Is the housing individual? Or not?
So these are kids with seizures, right? Who does it miss out if I go to just the hospital? Yeah, kids who don't go to the hospital, right? Kids who don't go to the hospital, don't get treated. And so, and maybe those are the kids that are really, that where there is a linkage or a stronger linkage. And so the problem with the case control is that when you choose your case, you're not choosing the cases from a random sample of the population, right? You have to, by definition of a case control, figure out how you're going to find this group of people. So the way around that is to do a cross-sectional survey where you're not going to exclude people based upon whether or not they can go to the hospital or not. The downside is that if it's something like a rare condition, like hyperactivity, I guess is fairly rare. If it's something like that, is that then you may have a tough time finding enough kids who sort of fit the criteria that you're looking for. Okay. Follow-up study. Right, so follow-up study, that's what you do is you start with your study population and you exclude those who basically already have the outcome. So you're starting with a group of people who don't have the outcome. Then you're going to follow them over time, and then you're going to look to see who gets the outcome versus who doesn't get the outcome. Okay, so let's take lead intoxication and hyperactivity in children. So what's your dependent variable? Hyperactivity. Your independent variable is lead. So you're going to start by excluding anyone who's hyperactive. So let's say, so that's the first step. So you get a bunch of kids and you measure hyperactivity and you exclude all those who are hyperactive. And now what you're going to do is you're going to measure over time the hyperactivity, the level of hyperactivity over time as a relationship to their lead exposure. So how would you do that? How long would you have to follow kids? A couple of years. I mean, you have to find kids who have, ideally what you're looking for is kids who have just moved into a house that have lead. And so what you're going to do is you're going to follow them over time to see whether or not they develop hyperactivity or not. So it becomes a little bit tough to do it for things that take a long time. It's a bit tough to do it. But the advantage of it is that it allows you to get the causality. Because the problem with both the cross-sectional and with the case control is that you never know whether there's something like this going on. But if you do a follow-up study, then you can basically, you can tell, because you're essentially starting with kids who are going to get exposure versus not exposure, and then see whether or not it's association with seizures. So you're much more likely to be able to see the causal relationship. So the advantage of a follow-up study is that you can do the more causal relationship. Okay. Experiment study, that's where you manipulate something. And so experimental study, what you do is you start with a population, you then give one group, one trial or one intervention and the other group another intervention. And then what you do is you then compare at the end of it, your outcome variable. So in this case, you're manipulating it. You're coming through and saying, this is the group that we're going to get this thing to, this is where we're going to get that thing to, and then we compare it. In the randomized controlled trial, would you have to worry, would you have to worry about measuring things like under birth weight and all these other type of factors? Imagine if you're doing this as a randomized controlled trial. So you took kids and you said to one group of kids, here's some lead to eat. And the other group of kids, you said, we're going to make sure you don't eat lead. And so then you measure then hyperactivity at the end of that, right? So let's say that's your experiment. Do you have to worry about things like under birth weight and things like that if you do a randomized control trial like that? Does it get over the under birth weight problem? I'll give you a hint. The answer is yes. So why does it get around the under birth rate problem? The ecological fallacy. Well, because there's people in this group are just as likely to have been under birth rate as people in this group. So therefore, since there's no reason to think that the samples are going to be different, that your conditions are going to be different by this, is that if lead's really not important, then the group of kids who licked the lead are going to show no more hyperactivity than the group of kids who didn't lick the lead, right? So therefore, as long as you randomize, then all these different things you don't have to worry about anymore, because it, it means that you've that there's as long as you truly randomize, and as long as there's no differences between your two groups and no systematic differences between your two groups, is that then any impact that you see is just going to be due to the fact that you change. That's the reason why people do randomized control trials, and why randomized control trials are sort of seen as the gold standard, because you can truly just sort of get a notion about whether this factor is important. Okay. So let's do the example that we had last time. So we decided that we were going to look at, just recall, is that here's August 24th, beginning of the semester. And then we said, well, people are going to sleep or no sleep. And then they're going to either have midterms. Well, either we're going to have stress or no stress, stress or no stress, stress, right? And we said that on midterms, people are going to do good or bad, 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 right? So that's what so we sort of said that this is the basic relationship that we're looking at. And because of that, they either get good sleep or no sleep, etc. So we were saying is that there's a temporal relationship here between sleep, stress, doing well. So the idea being is that bad sleep leads to more stress. More stress leads to bad scores. Bad scores leads to more stress. More stress leads to worse sleep. And then so it goes something like that type of relationship. All right. So let's say that you want to look at something about this. So what I want you to do is to first get together and decide what you would do if you're going to design a cohort study on this. So that means that you've got to identify what your independent and dependent variables are, and you have to then go through it and tell me what group you're going to select to basically follow. What's the group you're going to select, and then what's your independent variables that you're going to measure. Okay. I can see the enthusiasm in your eyes. So let's do it. So break into groups. So groups of a couple, and then go through and come up with me. What's your independent variable? What's your dependent variable? Who's the group that you're going to follow? We'll go back up to this. Who's the outcome that you're going to reach versus the group that doesn't have the outcome? And then what's your independent variables that you're going to go through and try to assess. Good? All right, go. So that means you probably groups of 2 or 3, something like that. Okay, you ready? Okay, so what's your dependent and independent variables? Sleep is the independent. So the factor one. Okay. The factor one is sleep, leading to factor two. Factor two, which is with academic performance. Yeah. Okay. Academic performance. Academic performance. And how are you defining each of these different things?
Less hours before lunch, before hours.
So sleep just means number of hours?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just I'm asking you, I guess I'm asking you how you operationalize this. So how you're gonna operationalize this is the number of hours. How do you? Okay, so I mean, how do you, like, if I were to ask you, if I were to ask, how well did you sleep last night? Right? How would you? Would you want to know like last night, or do you want to know like for a week? How are you going to measure what sleep means? Yeah. Okay, so what's the number of hours? And why 7 and 8? Is everyone in here, is 8 hours the optimal amount of sleep for you? I mean, 6. I mean, how many would say, so yeah, what number is probably what's the minimum number of hours that you need? Yeah. 7.5.
There were actually studies that supported that, so it's only do 7.5.
Uh-huh. 7.5. So for me, it's about somewhere like 7, maybe a little bit less than 7. Yeah. I mean, I can get by with 6.5 for a couple nights, but then it starts to get to me. But 7's kind of the minimum. On the other hand, what's the maximum? I never go more than 8 hours asleep, or at least rarely ever go more than 8. So for me, like if I were to sleep 9 hours, I would just lay there and stare at the ceiling for 2 hours. So who is less than 7? Are you less than are you less or more than 7? Yeah, but what's like if you didn't have lots of pressures in life, like if you're just on vacation, how many hours would you sleep? 8 to 10? Yeah. I mean, because that's the question, right? I guess that is the question. Is the question like how many hours you ideally would like to have to sleep? What's the minimum number that you need? And then how do you take account for the fact that people are going to differ?
Then you might want to have both answers. So you can understand exactly how stressed they are, that they're achieving their sleep goals because of the stress. So that might even be beneficial to have both information, because I could say, I wish I could have 8 hours sleep every day. But realistically, I'm only getting 4, I think you might have to pay me 1.
Okay, so you might sort of ask them, so the way that you would do this, you start by saying, how many hours would you ideally get? So your ideal number. Then how many hours do you normally get?
Yeah.
Normally get. And then-
time frame. When you say that I would wanna say it's like 2 weeks of midterm cruising,
Yeah,
so maybe even comparing their first week of school to middle.
well, we care about sleep because it's, the assumption being is that it's going to decrease our cognitive ability. Is that right? Is that the assumption for why you think that sleep is related to academic performance? Okay, so how do you, measure, decreased cognitive functioning? I'm sorry, say it louder. Well, yeah, that you're putting a lot of faith in test scores as being indications of people's cognitive functioning. I mean, because you're thinking about, like, sometimes if I don't get enough sleep, I feel like I'm just in a fog. I just sort of, and especially if I fly, if I fly a long distance and I come back the next day and I think I'm okay, and then suddenly I realize is that I'm just sort of bumping in the walls and sort of, even though I don't think of myself as a fog, I realize that I really am just in a fog.
And you have one group to get something, another group to get something, and then you compare it.
Okay. And so how would you, you could just do it just totally just based upon amount of sleep that you get. Forget about the whole subjective, what they feel about it. Just sort of say, just pick 7 hours and say, we'll just use that as the norm, even though some people might, be able to get by without 7 hours of sleep, or they don't need 7 hours of sleep. We're just going to say that it's going to be 7 hours. I mean, you can see the trade-off here, right? The trade-off is that if you're gonna, try to make it more personalized, then, you're into this, well, ideal sleep versus your cognitive, ideal sleep versus what you get, but then you also have to figure out how to measure cognitive, limitations of that. But another way to do it is just say, well, we're going to bypass all that and just say 7 hours. If you get less than 7 hours, we're going to assume that you're more cognitively limited than if you get more than 7 hours. Okay. So who's the group? Well, since this is a case control, right? Who are your control, or who's your cases and who's your controls? That's it. Because you start with the outcome, right? What's the outcome that you care about? That's your dependent variable. So you want to pick out people based upon, upon the cases. So what's the case? What's the level of academic performance that you're going to identify as your cases? Say it again.
3.0, a GPA of 3.0.
Do you want to do it on GPA or you want to do it on test scores? Oh, yeah. Okay. Why?
Because she said that first thing is very good indicator.
Yeah.
But throughout the school year, depending on your week, will affect your cognitive ability. So affect the homework, your study, all other things related to your academic life. So we can measure like time frame, midterm grade or midterm GPA, final GPA, and then we keep to follow them up years, like throughout their whole 4 years here. So we keep kind of get like that.
You could, but we're doing a case control, right? So you can't follow up people. Yeah. So it's just going to be, so you got to pick your cases. So you're going to do based on low GPA. So what if I, last year I got a bunch of sleep and I did really well. And this semester, I'm getting no sleep. And I'm gonna look like a high GPA person, right? So are you gonna only ask about my sleep in last year? I mean, that's when the GPA would be from, right? It'd be from previous semesters. So you're not, I mean, it's okay to do it this way, but see what I mean is that, because you're saying is that,
With the gap,
okay, what do you mean?
like you said, in previous year.
Yeah.
That's good for now. You're starting off with the previous GPA, so there's a gap.
Yeah,
I would-
but I mean, but you could, yeah. I don't know. It's a good question. Because how would you, I mean, if this is your association here, right? All right, so are you just, where does anxiety fit in there?
So there's one people that get a lot of sleep for that, like, that's the night,
Uh-huh,
so, it's like, okay, you get the 7 hours at 8, so you still feel like 90, and then I keep it going, that has the.
yeah, so I mean, so there's anxiety, which is just like if you ask, well, what factors influence your test score, right? Having anxiety, having test anxiety influences your test score, right? What else influences your test score? How much you study, right? How smart you are, I guess. I mean, to some degree. Although, to be honest with you, I've taught for a long time. I think that intelligence is overrated in terms when you get to your level, right? When you get to everyone's in this class, is that there's not that much difference between people and their intelligence. And so, you know, it usually comes down to things like how much you study and do you have a good system for studying and do you know, have a second job and all those different type of things. So, but anyways, but you know, we'll accept there are some differences that can do it. I think it'd be hard to measure intelligence. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I just wanna know if like my head is in the right place, there's like the safety degree, the students not low for it. And then maybe to have low sleep.
Yep.
And then control group would be, the students who got hired, like if that's the right way or.
Yep.
if it would be-
Yep, that's exactly right. So that would be, because that's different than your way. Your way is saying, look at GPA, pick students with high GPA, low GPA, then trying to assess their sleep over time. Yours would be saying, let's just pick the class and look at the low performers in the class, look at get the high performers in the class. Well, let's start with that. Let's take the low performers in the class, and that's your cases. Now you need to find your control. So how would you find the control to that group? I mean, if you think about, if you look at who is likely to do poorly on an exam, it would be people with test anxiety. That's one group, right? But what else, what other factors are going to be important? I mean, because, you know, because this is how it was, because if you just pick low performers and high performers, is that, you know, maybe the high performers are more intelligent and they don't have jobs and they, you know, all these other things that go along with it that make them high performers. And the low performers, you know, have all these other type of factors that mean that they're like test anxiety and things like that. But you just want to isolate one of those factors, which is sleep. So what you ideally would like to have is a group of low performers and then a similar group of people who did better, but have the same characteristics as those low performers. Yeah, well, no, but see, that's the one thing you want to vary, right?
Right.
But it would be the same kind of, like, if, for example, if you look at the low performers and they all have jobs, right? Then you'd want to find high performers and see if they all had jobs. You know, get the high performers with jobs. So you're not just comparing high performers who don't have jobs and can study all day, you know, versus low performers who have jobs and can do all the other things. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, we'll do an experiment then. Yeah. So we could try it. I'd have a hard time enforcing, like for the group that I said low sleep group. I probably would have to like ring him at 2 a.m. and say, time to get up, right? So you could do it, right? You could sleep deprive one group on purpose, and the other group, you could move them down into, into a nice hotel that's nice and quiet, and let them just sort of sleep, and then gently knock on the door at 8 o'clock. Yeah, so you could do that. It would, and they do sleep experiments that way, where they do interrupt people in their sleep, so it's not, it's not unheard of, and that would be a way of kind of testing it. But that's not the type of study we're doing. We're doing case control, where you're just going to pick these groups. How about if we did this as a cross-sectional? How would it differ if we did a cross-sectional study?
We take, but not us, just in general,
Uh-huh.
we take those that get the sleep,
Uh-huh.
versus those that don't get the sleep.
Well, cross-sectional, remember, you start with everyone, right? So you're looking at everyone. So you're looking to see, I mean, cross-sectional is that, the relationship you're looking at, like if you do test scores. So your dependent variable is test score. And your independent variables would be, well, what's the things that predict your test score? So number of hours of sleep.
Quality of sleep, well,
Quality of sleep. What else? Whether or not you have test anxiety. Test anxiety. What other factors would be important? Where would you figure out these factors? How would you know these things? If because we're just making up this list, right? But if you're really doing this, how would you figure out what this was? Say it again. Yeah, I mean, you're on the right track. Yeah.
for the quality and the time we need to watch. For the monitor,
Oh, yeah, you could do one of the little Fitbit things that does quality of sleep.
the test anxiety, we put midterms or like a big exam.
Uh-huh.
We could either question them or give them a survey real quick.
Uh-huh.
And ask them how
Uh-huh.
anxious are you from like 0 to 10 or 1 to
Yeah.
5 before the.
Yep. So hang on to that, because that's all follow-up studies, right? That's all follow-up study, because I'm hammering this home because that's the problem with the cross-sectional study, is that everything has to be done at one point in time. Yeah.
Going off of that watch idea,
Uh-huh.
you could have a watch list, so you can also measure your temperature.
Uh-huh.
They keep it where like, right before they go to sleep, and then if there's a spike in temperature, like your body temperature,
Uh-huh.
they could indicate like their stress levels as well.
Uh-huh.
Or like if it tracks their heart rate, like that's all being tracked on the watch.
Uh-huh.
So they can see like different, like analyze different types of data while all of this is happening. And like, let's see if their heart rate spikes right before the test. So that way they're hitting it at that.
Yeah. Great idea. Not a cross-sectional survey, but great idea. No, I mean, it is. I mean, because you're right. That's what you could do. Because, so hang on to that, because when we do a follow-up study, and that, you can see one of the advantages of a follow-up study is that you could get much more accurate, you could set it up, get much more accurate measures of each of these different things. I mean, at this point, though, with a cross-sectional or a case control, you're relying upon somehow what you're going to ask them, right? What they can, so you've got to, because you can't sort of say, what was your, what did your watch say on your quality of sleep? Because, most people aren't going to have a watch that does that. So where do I get, so short of doing a survey, where can I get this list of things? Where can I get this list? Rhymes with literature. The literature. Yeah, I mean, that's why you go through and you look at studies, right? You look at previous studies. So when you look at a previous study, you're not just looking at kind of just, what they found, but you're looking to see what is it that they basically, what's the factors that they considered when they went through and that they were measuring this. That's where you get it from. The other way you could get it is to do what type of study? rhymes with qualitative. A qualitative study, right? You could do a qualitative study. Because, what a qualitative study would do is so the way that typically that you would go through and do this, and the way we're going to do it, is that you start by identifying these things. And then you set up a qualitative study and you talk to people and you find out whether or not these factors seem like they're important factors or not. Or are there other things that come out from it? Because, like for example, it could be is that the situation for students at UC Merced is just different than the situation students at other universities where they've done this for whatever reason. So that's why, oftentimes you start with this, the literature review, to come up with your both your independent variables, but also in your dependent variables, but also how to measure them. And then you do a qualitative study to talk to people to see, does that look like it's the right type of things that do we have the right type of factors that we're considering, or are there things that are important that we're not considering? Okay. So hold on to that, because that's basically assignment 3, is going through and doing this. So now let's do follow-up study. So you get the idea of the cross-sectional. You've got to somehow measure everything. You've got to deal with recall. The problem with this is that how do you get people's recall of their sleep? And so one way to do it is you just ask people, how'd you sleep? Scale of 1 to 10, how'd you sleep? And let people, give just check on it. And it's just subjective. You don't worry about trying to parse out the number of hours and everything else. It's just more of a subjective amount. Another way to do it is just ask, over the last week, write down the approximate number of hours you slept each night. You have them write it down, or whatever it's going to be. So there's different ways that you can ask that. Follow-up study is different, right? Because a follow-up study, you're going to talk to people and you can get them to do things. And then you can, collect the data as they go along. And then you can look then at the end of that, what the, you can measure your outcome at the end of that. So do a follow-up study, design a follow-up study now for this. Go. Okay, we ready? Okay, so who wants to tell me their follow-up study? Do you have your follow-up study?
Yeah, so we put it up there, like, then we jot down the data each day.
Okay.
We give them the visit.
Uh-huh.
And then try to run the
Right.
Yeah. So for the test scores, it would be, like, throughout the semester.
Okay. So you recruit everyone, like just a group of people.
Yeah.
Okay. And you bring them in. Do you give them a Fitbit?
Yeah.
Okay. So you give them a Fitbit, and then you have them wear their Fitbit, because if you give them a Fitbit, you probably you can monitor it, right? As long as they wear it, you can monitor it, because it shows you quality of sleep every night and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you follow them along, and then how do you measure test scores? I mean, how do you assess their academic performance?
I don't know, I guess dates, or
Okay.
different scale.
They get like one grade, they get at the end of the semester along with their,
And how do you control for differences in class, in difficulty in class? Do you need to? No? That's okay. I mean, but I mean, because you can see is that like because you're doing something where you're saying, let's pick people and just, we're not going to specify it to like this class, right? We're going to take people who are taking lots of different classes, lots of different years, etc. And then we're going to go through and sort of monitor them throughout the semester. And so, academic performance then is going to be, I mean, because you could just sort of say their total GPA at the end of that semester, and the fact that some people might be taking organic chemistry and other ones, basket weaving, that's just gonna wash out, right? So you could just do it that way. Or you could sort of say, well, we're gonna go through and somehow control for quality of class or difficulty in class, or we're gonna only pick a class that's, only pick certain people in a certain class, not in all classes. Could do that. How would you decide? How are you gonna do it?
We're thinking of the student population would be students within the same, major,
Uh-huh,
like public health.
okay.
Um,
So you can see that picking the same major kind of, narrows it down a bit.
and it'd be way different than people in STEM, computer science. And
Yeah.
people.
I mean, what's the downside of doing that? Like, what's the upside about picking everyone rather than just one major?
And get a full representation of the quality of sleep or the sleep and the outcome of that.
Are there differences between students who go into public health versus those who go into engineering?
Yeah.
So, which way did the differences go? Are they more likely to make it so that there's more relationship between sleep and academic performance in public health, or less of a relationship?
Talking to my friends who are in tech, I would say like, I mean, if the goal is college students, I don't know, it would be beneficial to have, but if you're going to be within public health majors.
Yeah.
Then,
Yeah, because if you do public health majors, you're controlling for some of the other factors, like you're not comparing students who are taking organic chemistry with those who are taking basket weaving, right? So you're controlling for that. But what you're doing though is by selecting a group of students, is that, students are different who go into different majors. So it could be that public health majors all can handle stress perfectly, and all could, and so therefore you're not going to see some big relationship between stress and academic performance or stress and sleep.
would that fall into bias?
Well, yes, it would, and it means that your population is not representative of the. I should ask you that. Why is it a bias? Because it means your population that you're choosing is not representative of the total population. So another way to do it would be to choose two different groups, right? Say we're going to do this with a group of engineers, and we're going to do it with a group of public health students. Maybe pick upper division, because if you pick upper division, then they're not taking the lower division courses, but only courses in their major. So these are more likely to be courses in their major, something like that.
Or something, like bio, you know, the, a lot of, in that class.
Yeah.
Or something, government goals.
Yep. So you could also then pick a class, right? Pick a class, because that controls for both that, because then you're not going to worry about the major, or at least you can measure, you can see if there's differences between the majors, when you go through and that you do your analysis. But because it's all one class, you don't have to worry about the difficulty of the class. So the benefits of a single class is that you then control for the fact that people might be taking different classes. What's the disadvantages of a single class? What's the disadvantage of just focusing only upon one class?
Again, with the whole representation.
So I mean, that's a good point. There's representation about, well, who's taking that class, right? But what about what type of classes do you think that it's more likely that there's going to be a relationship between sleep, and academic performance?
Like classes that are required for their major
Mhm.
specifically. If we're looking just specifically at like majors, other things.
Yeah.
We could look at like. Maybe there's like trends and like the ones that they do the worst at, I guess, like the ones that like super are the hardest. Like I know like organic chemistry is really hard, and
Right.
that's one of the read out courses.
Yeah.
So you could do that like, to look at specific classes.
There was a class that when I first got here was taught, where I looked at the ratings that the person got for their course at the end of the semester, and it was always like 7s. Students just loved this course, and I thought, man, what a good teacher this person must be. And then I looked at the syllabus, and the course was called something like, what was that? Public Health and Media or something like that. But basically, he showed movies every day. Every day he showed movies, and he sort of said, "Oh, you don't have to come. I'll I'll test you on 3 movies throughout the semester and I'll let you know which movies they are. And so it's like, it turned out that students really liked that class. And I bet you that stress levels in that class were pretty low when it came down to the time. So I mean, I think there is like this, you know, that's the downside about doing a class, is that you need a class where there's enough stress to be able to see this relationship, not too much stress, like in organic chemistry, where everyone's gonna, you know, panic, and not too little stress, where, you know, and so that's the advantage of doing it across all courses, all people, is you don't have to worry about that. Okay. Sorry, I'm being spam. All right, well, I think we're out of time. So start there next time. No, next time, actually, we're done with this now about the different type of designs. So next time we move into designing questionnaires. And I'll post assignment 3 by the end of the day. Hey. Take care. Have a good weekend. Oh,
Did we just send you an email or is there a link?
there's I sent a